Book of Numbers in chapter 34, we saw the promised land borders and the boundaries. I show you this map on the board, and this map will change based on who drew the map. It changes slightly, but this is pretty close to what the land divisions would be like when Israel would finally cross the Jordan River under Joshua. Right now, remember, everything that we're reading about is taking place right here. You see the city Jericho, if you could read that, is right at this blue line right here going north and south is the Jordan River. And right here in this little circle I'm trying to paint, that's the land of Moab. Those are the plains of Moab. So as Moses is getting these instructions that we're about to read about, the instructions in Numbers 34 about the land divisions, about who was going to be in charge, they're all in that little circle of land in the land of Gad. They're in a circle right here. There's a couple million Jews ready to cross over the Jordan River whenever God says, go. But they're not going to leave until Moses dies, because Moses is not allowed by God to cross the Jordan River. Anytime, and I'll say it again in a minute, anytime you see Moses' name, the Lord spoke to Moses, the Lord said to Moses, you know that we're on the east side of the Jordan River. We're not in the promised land yet. Moses does not cross the Jordan River into the promised land. We'll see that. But last time we noticed that even to God's own nation, Israel, listen, even to His own chosen people, He doesn't give the entire Middle East. He could have said, take any land you want, it's yours. That's not what He did. In Numbers chapter 34, He said, these are your borders. And He named the northern border, the eastern border, the southern border, and the western border. And we read all about that last week. By definition, a nation is not a nation unless it has borders. And because this is such a hot topic today with open borders, there's a European group. Oh, what is the name of it? I heard the name the other day. Does anybody know what the name is? There's a group of 26 nations, and I'm not talking about the European Union. There's another name that's a strange name. That there's 26 European nations that are existing as if they have no borders. You don't have to have a passport. There's a certain name given to these nations, and you can freely cross. You can just cross. There's no stop. There's nothing. You just keep on going. You go from France to Switzerland to the next country, to the next country, to the next. There's 26 of them, and within those 26 nations, there are no borders. I would say that those are no longer nations. Because the Scripture says if you don't have borders, you're by definition not a nation. Who rules what then? What government is in charge? Who has jurisdiction if a crime takes place at this border area where there is no border? All of that is nonsensical. I just want to show you a couple of verses from the Bible because borders is such a big issue today. I believe in borders. Because God established borders even for the nation Israel. He could have told His own, whatever land you want, you take it, but He didn't. Because God establishes borders. So just two quick verses before we get into Numbers 35. Because of what's going on at the United States' southern border and our current administration leaning very hard toward a borderless existence. We would cease to be the United States of America if we didn't have borders protecting our nation, limiting where we go and where we don't go, the way that God limited Israel in where they established their homes and where they don't. In Acts chapter 17, Paul is speaking in the city of Athens in Greece, and this is what he says about God and about borders. Paul says in Acts 17, verse 26, this is Paul's famous speech on Mars Hill, M-A-R-S, Mars Hill. And this is what he said. He was talking to the Athenians, and he said, God made from one man. Who's that one man? Adam. God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. And look what God did. He determined their appointed times, because nations have births and nations have deaths. Nations come and nations go. He determined their appointed times, and also look what He did. And He appointed the boundaries of their habitation. Boundaries, borders. The United States of America has boundaries. We have a Pacific Ocean, we have an Atlantic Ocean, we have our neighbors to the north, Canada, our neighbors to the south, Mexico. Those are the borders of this country, and those are boundaries of habitation that God has established. Because Paul says it. God establishes borders. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, the second and the last verse concerning borders, this is Moses speaking, teaching a series. Deuteronomy is a series of lectures, a series of teaching sessions, maybe 8 of them. It depends on how people divide them. But they're lessons, they're Bible lessons that Moses gives Israel. You've got this second generation of Israel poised on the plains of Moab, ready to cross the Jordan. They need information. They're about to go in and be a nation with borders. They're about to have to establish government. How is government going to work? What are we going to do with murderers? What are we going to do with manslayers? You think, murderers? Where'd you come up with that? We're about to learn about that in Numbers chapter 35, because there has to be order and the land has to be pure and purified before God will exist there. So Deuteronomy is this series of I hate to call them lectures, but teaching sessions that Moses has with this second generation of Israel to train them to go into the land. He's teaching them. Deuteronomos, the word Deuteronomy means the second giving of the law. Duet. You can almost, if you change the E and the U, you can hear our word for two people, a duet. Deutero means second. The first time Israel got the law, they were on Mount Sinai, and God gave the law to Moses. The second time Israel got the law, it was through Moses' mouth in the book of Deuteronomy. The second generation, Moses reminds these young men of what God taught him and told him on Mount Sinai. Nomos, the second part of Deuteronomy, nomos means law. N-O-M-O-S is the word for law. So the book of Deuteronomy is the second giving, the second recitation of the law of Moses. God gave it to Moses on Mount Sinai. That's the first time. Moses gives it to the second generation. That's the second time. But what does Moses have to say? That's an aside. What does Moses have to say to the children of Israel about boundaries, about borders? He says, when the Most High, we're talking about El Elyon, a title for God, God Most High, when God the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, their pieces of land, when He separated the sons of man, He is God, God the Father, Elohim, Yahweh. He set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Boundaries and borders defined nations. And we get that idea, we get that truth, not that idea, we get that truth from the Bible. So, if anyone wants to argue with you about these, I hope I've armed you with at least a couple of verses about the fact that borders are defined by God, and a nation without borders is no longer a nation by definition. So in Numbers chapter 34, God says you're going to go and take this land. These are the borders. He calls out 2 people to be the first overseers of land grants. Reminds me of what Stephen Austin did with his 300 families he brought into the land of Mexico when they gave him land grants. I know some of you can trace your heritage all the way back to those original 300 settlers that Austin brought in. I'm fascinated by that. I'm a history guy. I love that idea. But when a country gets, or when a land says, or you can come in and have this land, there have to be people in charge of which sections of land each family gets. That's what Stephen Austin did. He separated the land and he chose the families, and they set up in the state of Texas in the areas in which we live now. Brazoria County was huge Austin land grant land. This is what God is setting up with Israel. He's chosen two men, Eleazar, who's the high priest, and Joshua, the son of Nun, to be the Stephen Austins of the day. You're going to be the ones that separate the land, that oversee all this giving of the land by lot. Lot, not capital L, small l. I'm not talking about Lot the man. I'm talking about by casting lots, you will determine which tribe gets which piece of land. Eleazar was in charge of that, and Joshua was in charge of that. Once they cross the Jordan, where are they going to settle? Where Eleazar and Joshua tell you to, that's where you're going to settle. God chose one man from each of the 9.5 tribes that were going to cross the river. And so one man from each of the 9.5 tribes that are going to cross the river to be in charge of actually establishing the land once they get it. That's what we saw. But there's one tribe, and we push forward, there's one tribe that we didn't read about. In all the sons of Israel that are listed in Numbers chapter 34, the tribe of Levi doesn't get its name mentioned. Levi doesn't get a piece of land. Levi doesn't have, look at this list again. If you looked at it closely and for a minute, you don't see the name Levi written in capital letters anywhere. And Levi was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. What about Levi? Where do his people live? Well, thank the Lord for Numbers chapter 35, because it answers the questions. What about the tribe of Levi? The priests of Yahweh. Remember, Levi are the family of priests. Where are the priests going to live? Look at Numbers chapter 35. Let's go through it. Numbers chapter 35. Now the Lord spoke to Moses. And if the Lord speaks to Moses, are they in the promised land or not yet? Not yet. If Moses is alive, they're not in the promised land. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan River, opposite Jericho. Remember, that's what I just told you. There's Jericho. So they were over here, opposite the Jordan River from Jericho. That's where all these things are taking place. And this is what God said. He said in verse 2, "Command the sons of Israel that they give to the Levites from their inheritance of their possession cities to live in. And you shall give to the Levites pasture lands around the cities. The cities shall be theirs to live in, and their pasture lands shall be for their cattle and for their herds and for all their beasts." Now look what God just did. He's giving within all these colored areas that you see on the board. In each of those areas, Asher, look at it up here. Asher is going to give some cities for Levites to spread out. Naphtali is going to give some cities in here for Levites to live. Zebulun, some cities to Levi. Issachar, some cities to Levi. Manasseh on the east side and on the west side of the Jordan, some cities for Levi. You get it? Levi was going to be spread out all throughout Israel. And each of these tribes was going to give cities to the Levites, to the priests, so that they can live in them. Yahweh would provide the food for the Levites. Don't mistake what's going on here. This is not farming land. It's pasture land. It's grazing land. It says it very clearly. It's for their cattle and for their herds and for all their beasts. An interesting thing to remember, that the priests are sinners too. So the priest would need animals to bring to the tabernacle to cover their sins also. So the priests would need places in pasture lands for their own cattle, for their own herds, and for all of their beasts also. Certainly they were going to eat some of those in the course of a year, but this isn't primarily for food. This isn't farming land. This is pasture land. God would provide the food that the priests would eat through the sacrifices that Israel would bring to the tabernacle. All of the sacrifices, most of them except the whole burnt offering, the priest would eat the meat after the fat, the entrails, the lobes of the fat lobe of the liver and all these things God talks about would be burned to God, but the rest of the animal the priest would eat. So God provided for the food for the Levites. In verse 4 it says, the pasture lands of the cities which you shall give to the Levites shall extend from the wall of the city. So imagine a city with the wall around it, and most of these ancient cities, if they were good-sized cities, had a wall, a protective wall. Remember, the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. These were walled cities. And so from the wall outward 1,000 cubits. A cubit doesn't mean anything to us today. A cubit is roughly 18 inches. By definition, it's the distance from a man's elbow to the tip of a man's fingers, and you can see I'm an average sized guy, and that's about 18 inches, this distance. And that's exactly what a cubit is. It's an 18-inch distance. So 1,000 cubits is about 500 yards. For you golfers, that's a long par 5. Just to visualize what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a massive piece of property. A city and 500 yards out from the wall, all the way around the city, would belong to the Levites. In verse 5 it says, you shall also measure outside the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, on the south side 2,000 cubits, on the west side 2,000 cubits, and on the north side 2,000 cubits, with the city in the center. This shall become theirs as pasture lands for the cities. Now it sounds like he's just, one time he says 1,000 cubits, and the next time he says 2,000 cubits, but what has changed? In verse 4, the measurement is from the city wall. In verse 5, the measurement is from the center of the city. So if you do the math, in a normal size city, it's about 750 yards out from the walls when you combine both of these bits of information. But it doesn't matter. The Levites were given 48 cities, as we're about to see, all scattered throughout the land. Look at what it says in verse 6. The cities which you shall give to the Levites shall be 6 cities of refuge. We'll talk about what that is in just a minute, what these 6 cities of refuge are, what they're for. So the cities which you shall give to the Levites shall be 6 cities of refuge, which you shall give for the manslayer to flee to. And in addition to them, you shall give 42 cities. Now, just so you have in your head, because we're going to talk about this at length in the next few minutes, a manslayer is someone who kills another human being unintentionally. We call this manslaughter to this day. You're guilty of manslaughter if you kill a man, albeit unintentionally. You're not a murderer. That's a different category. But you are a manslaughterer, or as the Old Testament says, a manslayer. And we're going to read all about that in the next few verses, so hold on to that. But a manslayer is an unintentional, a one who kills unintentionally another man. Very different from a murderer. Very different rules that God sets down for the manslayer and the murderer. Verse 7 says, all the cities which you shall give the Levites shall be 48 cities, together with their pasture lands. I don't know how well you can look at this, how you can see this writing. I guess some of you have good eyes and you can see it. But you'll see in all capital letters here, the lands of the tribes, Benjamin, Judah, Simeon, Ephraim, Manasseh, etc. And then you see all these other little cities. Every one of these cities, if you counted them, there are 42 dots on that, or 48, excuse me. There are 48 dots on that map, and those are the cities that each of these tribes gave the Levites to live in. You'll notice that they're spread out not only in the land of Canaan, but even on the wrong side. I'll say, even on the wrong side of the Jordan River, God spread out the Levites. Now, why would God do that? The Levites are the tribe of the priests, right? The priests. if the tabernacle and the temple is eventually going to end up in Jerusalem, and we know that it does, why wouldn't God just settle everyone around here, around the land of Jerusalem? Jerusalem is not named here because it's not a city of the Levites. But why not? Why not just park them all centrally, the priests? Why did God spread them out to live amongst the other tribes in the cities that those specific tribes would give them? And the answer is very simple, because the Levites had obligations before the people. The Levites were not only the priests of Israel, but they were the teachers of Israel, and they were also the counselors of Israel. Now listen to this fact as you look at that map. The priest's responsibilities were not only to bring sacrifice daily to God at the tabernacle, but they were also to teach and to counsel the rest of the tribes of Israel in the law of Moses. They're the teachers of the land. How can you teach if everybody lives so far from you? Look at the dimensions of the country of Israel. I'm going to tell you something that's fascinating about the way God provides for His people. If you go north to south in Israel, that's the map of Israel today on the right. If you go north to south in Israel, you're covering 263 miles. That's tiny. It's more miles than that from here to Dallas, Texas. That's a tiny distance. If you go from east to west, wrong direction. If you go from east to west in the land of Israel, any guesses? 71 miles. Well, that's about from here to Houston. We're talking about a tiny piece of land. So tiny that as a matter of fact, most, and I'm talking about the vast majority of the settled people in the land of Israel, based on the map on the left where Israel would settle, the vast majority, you could say almost every Jew lived within 10 miles of a Levitical priest. Because God's going to take care of His people Israel, and He wants them to know about Him and the people on earth that He has placed to be the teachers of Israel about the things of God are the Levites. So God makes sure that a Levite is almost within a stone's throw of every man, woman, and child in Israel. That's why He spread them out. So that the people of Israel could learn and continue learning about Yahweh from the priests, the Levites. Every Jew needed to be taught, and every Jew needed to be counseled in the ways of the Lord and the law of Moses. The Torah, the book of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, that was the way that God would have them grow as a people. So He put the Levites all around them. The Levites were given 48 cities. 48 cities, that's what's on the board, and their surrounding pasture lands. And that's where the Levites lived, and that's only where the Levites lived. 6 of these cities, as we saw, are the cities of refuge. Now let's talk about what a city of refuge is. It says in verse 6, the cities of refuge were the places, the cities, the 6 cities where a manslayer would flee to. Now, what Yahweh was controlling, what God was controlling in Israel was blood feuds. Blood feuds. Where you kill my cousin and then I go kill your cousin, and then you kill another one of my cousins, then I go kill another one of your cousins, and the Hatfields and the McCoys start, and there's no end to a blood feud. And that's disorderly, and it pollutes the land of Canaan where God would live. So God says, a man shall stand trial. He was controlling someone who was a manslayer, not a murderer, who unintentionally killed somebody. He was protecting that man until that man could serve trial before a jury of his peers. Sound familiar? The cities of refuge protected men until the facts could be heard. because everybody has a right to face their accuser, even someone who's killed someone else. You have to be able to face the facts. The facts have to be able to come out. And so the cities of refuge protected men until the facts could be heard, until an accused man could stand trial. I'll make a statement. To execute an innocent man. To execute an innocent man is as evil in God's sight as to exonerate a guilty man or let go a guilty man. To execute an innocent man is as evil in the sight of God. It's killing. It's wrongful killing. So to execute an innocent man is as evil in God's sight as to exonerate a guilty man. You don't let a guilty man go, but you don't kill an innocent man. Every man has to stand trial, as we'll see as this unfolds. Look at verse 8. As for the cities which you shall give from the possession of the sons of Israel, you shall take more from the larger, you shall take less from the smaller. Each shall give some of his cities to the Levites in proportion to his possession which he inherits. All that means is in the larger pieces of territory, a few more cities. In the small pieces like Benjamin, fewer cities for the Jews, for the Levites. If you want to see the end of this, I'll show you a verse. This is what we're getting here is simply the instructions for the future. When you enter into the land of Canaan, when you separate all the lands by these 9.5 tribes, when the tribes are settled into land, then they're going to give the Levites cities within the lands. If you go to Joshua chapter 21, we're not going there, just write it down. It actually happens in Joshua chapter 21. It takes 21 more chapters before Israel enters into the land, establishes their tribal territories enough for the cities to be given to the Levites. The fulfillment of what's being presented here as instruction happens in Joshua chapter 21. Look what it says in Joshua 21, verse 1 and 3. Then the heads of the households of the Levites, that's who we're talking about, the Levites who get their 48 cities. The heads of the households of the Levites approached Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun. Why would they go to them two? Because those are the two men that God said would be in charge of land distribution. They knew it, so that's who they went to. The heads of the household of the tribes of the sons of Israel, they spoke to them at Shiloh in the land of Canaan. So they're in the promised land, they're in the land of Canaan, and this is what the Levite leaders said. Yahweh commanded through Moses to give us cities to live in with their pasture lands for our cattle. Where did he say that? Where did Yahweh command through the man Moses to give cities to the Levites to live in, to give the pasture lands for the Levites for their cattle? In what book of the Bible did God make that command? In Numbers chapter 35, exactly where we are. If you don't know the whole Bible, stuff like that is just going to make no sense. You're not going to have any depth to that. But we know we're studying the whole Bible, so we can read Joshua and say, that harkens back to Numbers 35, where this promise, this command from God actually took place. And since the Levites brought this fact up to Joshua and to Eleazar, not that they had forgotten, but the Levites bring it up, it says, so the sons of Israel gave the Levites from their inheritance these cities with their pasture lands for their cattle, according to the command of the Lord. That's exactly what we're learning about in Numbers chapter 35. When you get to Joshua chapter 21, it actually happens. We will get to Joshua chapter 21 sometime next year, and we'll see, and at that point we'll go back to Numbers 35, and I'll show you a verse from there that says, hey, remember that time when I said we were looking forward? Well, today we're looking backwards. That day will come. So the tribes of Israel are obedient to the command of Yahweh. And in Joshua chapter 21, they actually do give these cities to the Levites. In verse 9, we start digging into this idea of the cities of refuge. Let's look what it says. We're going to learn a lot about American law here and the foundations of American law. I'm talking about American law, 1776 to 2021. American law has its foundation in what we're about to read in Numbers chapter 35. You say, Rick, this Old Testament, we've been in it too long. There's just nothing back there for me. The law of our land comes from Numbers chapter 35. The Lord spoke to Moses, and He said, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select for yourselves cities to be your cities of refuge, that the manslayer who has killed any person unintentionally may flee there." The cities of refuge were safe havens until a proper trial date could be set, a jury of his peers could be gathered, witnesses could be called. That person who accidentally killed someone would flee. Say he was up in the land of Issachar and he committed an unintentional murder. He accidentally killed someone. He would immediately leave where he was and go to one of these 6 cities of refuge, because within the walls of that city of refuge, the blood avenger couldn't touch him. God protected him until a proper trial could be held and the facts could be shown. I mean, listen to what I'm saying and tell me that this isn't American law concerning a manslayer or a murderer. Now, we've gone wrong in the way we prosecute murderers, as we're about to see. It says the cities in verse 12, these 6 cities, 3 of which are on the right side, the east side of the Jordan River, and 3 of which are on the west side of the Jordan River in the land of Canaan. These cities shall be to you as a refuge from the avenger. Spooky, huh? The avenger. Who's the avenger? We'll see it in just a minute. He's another human being. He's a family member of the killed party. The city shall be as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer, the one who accidentally killed a relative of the avenger, will not die until he stands before the congregation for trial. Where does America get the foundation for our law? Tell me that it's not Numbers chapter 35. It's exactly Numbers chapter 35. We stand on the shoulders of Moses where we get our law. That's why I showed you this picture last time of the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in our land. And who do you see in the center of the United States Supreme Court building? At the apex, at the peak, is Moses in the center with the 2 tablets of the law. And we're reading the law right now. We are learning about the law of Moses right now in Numbers chapter 35. One of the laws that our nation stands on is that a man is innocent until he's proven guilty. And what does it say here? A city of refuge from the avenger. You protect him from the family's avenger, so that the manslayer doesn't die at the hand of the avengers until he stands before the congregation for trial. This is American law. I could show you, I could get Black's Law book out and I could show you where this says, where American law says the same thing. Innocent until proven guilty for a manslayer. In verse 13 it says, the cities which you are to give shall be your 6 cities of refuge. You shall give 3 cities across the Jordan and 3 cities in the land of Canaan. They are to be cities of refuge. So God spread these cities out throughout Israel. in a reasonable distance that anybody who accidentally kills another man, and that happens every day. People accidentally kill people every day in the world. In Israel, there was a place for them to flee while the facts are gathered so that they could stand trial. If they're guilty at trial, they'll hang. And we'll see that in just a second. These 6 cities shall be for refuge for the sons of Israel, in verse 15, and for the alien and for the sojourner among them. So this wasn't just a Jewish law. If there were Gentiles living among you, they get the same protection under the law. That anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there. And now we switch gears and we ask the question, does everyone who kills someone have the protection of the city of refuge? And the answer to that question is no. Look what it says in verse 16 to verse 21. This is a little subsection here, verse 16 to verse 21 of murder. Not manslaughter, murder. And look at the difference. For the manslayer, he's to flee to the city of refuge and be protected until his day of trial. But in verse 16, but if, not unintentional anymore, but intentional killing. But if he struck him down with an iron object, we've got 3 objects here, forced with a deadly weapon, forced with a lethal weapon, we call it. An iron object, a stone, and a wooden object, as we'll see. Look what it says. If he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall surely, what? Flee to the city of refuge? No, that's not what it says. The murderer shall surely be put to death. If he struck him down with the stone in the hand by which he died, and as a result he died, he is a murderer, the murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he struck him with a wooden object in the hand, by which he might die, and as a result he died, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall surely be put to death. And in America today, where we understand that a man is innocent until proven guilty, we have completely gone off the rails with how we treat convicted murderers. According to the law of Moses, and we're not Israel, but we can learn a principle from this. God expects the killer of a man to be killed, not preserved alive for 40 years on death row. This is just a biblical truth. It's a simple biblical truth. And in America, we have fought every time the liberals get, riled up. They fight capital punishment because it's unjust, this, that, inhumane. It was inhumane that murderer killed another person. That was inhumane. That's the unthinkable, that someone could draw up arms against someone and intentionally kill them for no reason. That's unthinkable. To kill a murderer is not unthinkable, that's biblical. From the hand of God. You're reading it in Numbers chapter 35. Capital punishment started in the Bible. Look what it says in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. To give you a placement, this is Noah's ark. After a year and a month of floating around, they have finally touched ground. Noah and his 3 sons and their wives all get out of the ark, and this is what God tells to Noah. Whoever sheds man's blood by man, by another man, his blood shall be shed. Why? Why, God? Why is there all of a sudden a death penalty placed on killing? Because in the image of God, God made man. When you kill another human being, you are killing an image bearer of God, and He takes that seriously. So if a man kills another man, then there is to be what we see in Numbers chapter 35, an avenger. It says, by man his blood shall be shed. In Numbers 35, that by man becomes the avenger. The Goel is the word in the Hebrew. Goel. The Goel. The Redeemer. Or the Avenger of blood, as we'll see him called. And this is one who protects his family by seeking vengeance for a crime. There is an established one in the family that is the Goel, and the Goel is the avenger of blood. If someone in our clan gets killed, that avenger of blood is the one who goes to kill that man. The tribe takes care of it. The family takes care of it. It was an interesting time. One who protects a family by seeking vengeance for a crime. The man has to stand trial. But if he's found guilty of murder, a family member is to take his life. Interesting time, isn't it? The blood avenger, look what it says in verse 19. Exodus chapter 35, it says, "The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. He shall put him to death when he meets him." This word Goel has a broad meaning because there was another Goel in the Bible. I'll tell you the story. You tell me what book. There was another story where a woman's husband is killed and her father-in-law is dead, and she goes back with her mother to the land of Israel. She is not a Jew, she's a Gentile. She goes back to the land of Israel with her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law says, "There is a Goel for the family of your father, of my husband. There is a redeemer in our family. There is someone who can marry you and buy back the rights of our tribal territory. He is a Goel. There is a family member established by the family of my dead husband who is one who protects his family." What's the name of the woman? What's the name of the Goel? Ruth is the woman, the Moabitess, the Gentile. And who was the redeemer of her late father-in-law's land? What was his name? Boaz. So Goel, you'll follow Goel throughout the Bible. There is one in every family who is the protector of the family. And if someone in Boaz's family would have been murdered, it would have been Boaz's sword that took the life of the murderer. He was the kinsman. He was the family member, redeemer of the family. He was the Goel. And so what God is saying in Numbers chapter 35, laying the foundations for all those things like Boaz and Ruth, here's where it's laid. He says the blood avenger, the Goel, the protector of the family, himself shall put the murderer to death. He shall put him to death when he meets him. In verse 20, we see more causes of death. Let's get through this. That are guilty of the death penalty. We saw force, lethal force. An iron object, a stone, a wooden object in the hand where you strike someone, you intend to kill them, and you kill them, you're a murderer, you should die. Here is another couple in verse 20. If he pushed him with hatred in his heart, if he pushed him out of hatred or threw something at him while he was lying in wait. Lying in wait is like hiding behind a bush. And when he comes, you attack him, you throw a stone at him or something to kill him. And as a result of either of these things, the man dies. There's another reason. This is even more, we talk about lethal weapon. This is blunt force trauma with your hands. Blunt force trauma where a man might injure someone, causing them to die with his own hand. In verse 21 it says, or if he struck him down with his hand in enmity, with some sort of strife in his heart, with some sort of struggle that was going on, with some sort of aggravation, with some sort of irritation, with some motivation that would cause a man to strike another human being with his own hands. The one who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. And the blood avenger shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. See, make no mistake, God is very clear about these things. Why? because God made man in His own likeness and His own image, and He protects men. He protects men. You cannot kill another man without there being consequence. Okay, so we know if you're a murderer, then you have to die. The manslayer will come find you. The goel of the family will come and kill you if you're a murderer. But look at what it says in verse 22. Let's go back to the manslayer for a minute. What's his penalty? The one who kills someone unintentionally. Verse 22 says, but if he pushed him suddenly without that strife, that struggle, that hatred, or he threw something at him without lying in wait. It wasn't premeditated. I'm not out to get you. It was an accident. Or with any deadly object of stone and without seeing it dropped on him so that he died, while he was not his enemy nor seeking his injury. This is accidental. I didn't mean it. It was an accident, a horrible accident. But nonetheless, it was an accident. Well, if that's the case, it says in verse 24, then the congregation shall judge, a jury of your peers. Where do we get these things as American law-abiding citizens? We get them from Numbers chapter 35. For everybody that says, this just isn't very relevant. Are you kidding? It's the foundation of America right here. Numbers chapter 35. The congregation shall judge between the slayer, the manslaughterer on one side, and the blood avenger on the other side who says, he needs to die, he killed my brother, he killed my cousin. So you have a defense and you have a prosecutor, one who wants to prosecute and kill, one who wants to defend, and you have a judge, the congregation, and the jury. The congregation, the judges are the Levites. The congregation is the jury. The congregation shall judge between the slayer and the blood avenger according to these ordinances. Isn't it also fascinating where America gets its laws? How can we be so sure that what we do with a manslaughterer or a murderer is okay in God's eyes? Numbers chapter 35, period. It's the end of the story. Numbers chapter 35. I waited until now to show you this verse from 40 years ago. Look what it says in Exodus chapter 21. Even these cities of refuge. Remember, I tell you, one day we'll get to Joshua 21 and we'll look back to Exodus chapter 35 and say that's where it was talked about, instructed, and in Joshua, here's where it's being done. Well, even the cities of refuge, now I take you back to Exodus chapter 21 and I say, see, God said He would do this one day. Look at what it says. God speaking to Moses, giving him the laws. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, isn't that what it just said? If he does not, if he threw something at him without lying in wait, it's already been said. If he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, accidentally, I would add, then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee. In Exodus chapter 21, verse 12 and 13, there's no mention of the cities of refuge, is there? But it says a place. And you keep on reading the Bible. I wonder what he talked about. You kind of back burner that, and then you get to Exodus chapter 35. Here's the place. Here's the place that God told Moses He would appoint. It's these 6 cities of refuge in the land of Canaan and on the east side of the river. We get to it. In verse 25, let's talk about the jury trial for just a minute. The congregation shall deliver the manslayer, save him from. The congregation shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the blood avenger. And the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge to which he fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who is anointed with holy oil. Here's the picture. You accidentally kill someone in the land of Egypt in these days. You've just crossed the Jordan. Joshua is the leader of Israel. Eleazar is the high priest. You accidentally kill someone while you're building a house or something. You flee to a place of refuge. Your congregation, now that you're safe in the place of refuge, A group has been assembled that will hear your case. You go back to your home. You go back to wherever you live, protected by the Levites. You stand trial in the place in which you caused the accident, in the place in which the death took place. We would call that in the proper venue. We take all our laws from Numbers chapter 35 concerning murder and manslaughter. You go back to the place in which the crime was committed. You stand trial. If you're found not guilty, then you're protected from the manslayer, from the goel. You won't be killed. But there's still a consequence. There's a consequence for unintentional killing of a child of God, one born in the image of God, not a child of God, one born in the image of God. Look what the consequence is. If you're found not guilty of murder, but you're still a manslaughterer, then your sentence is to go back. Look what it says. The congregation shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled. You leave the venue where the crime occurred. You go back to the city of refuge, and you have to live within the walls of that city until the death of the high priest. Look what it says in verse 26. If that manslayer at any time goes beyond the border of his city of refuge, if you walk outside the wall and the blood avenger finds him, that goel, that family member, if he finds him outside the border of the city of refuge, the blood avenger kills the manslayer, he will not be guilty of blood. The jail becomes the city of refuge. There is a consequence for manslaughter. It just isn't your death. But you will spend your life inside the walls of the city of refuge until the high priest dies, and then you can leave. If you leave the walls of that city and the avenger of blood finds you and kills you, he had every right to do it. That's what the Scripture says. So there was protection for the manslayer, but not complete protection. If he left the walls of his jail cell, the city of refuge, he was free inside the city of refuge, but that whole city became his jail. Verse 28 says, why is the avenger of blood not guilty? Because the manslayer should have remained in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest, because that's what God said. But after the death of the high priest, the manslayer shall return to the land of his possession. He's freed from guilt. He's done his sentence, and he can go back. Verse 29 says, these things shall be for a statutory ordinance to you throughout your generations in all your dwellings. This is the law of the land of Israel forever. Look what it says in verse 30. Let's just read them. Got very few notes left. Let's finish it. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses. But no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Jesus quotes this when he gets into the New Testament in his ministry. It takes 2 witnesses to kill someone. 2 witnesses, not one. Because one person may simply hate someone and conjure up this story about he killed somebody. 2 witnesses. But only 2. That's not a high number. 2 witnesses. Verse 31 says, moreover, you shall not take ransom. Now listen to this. You shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death. He shall surely be put to death. What does that mean? You may say, is there a price I can pay for his life? Is there an amount of money I can give to buy my family member out of his death sentence because he's a murderer? And God says, no. Guilty of murder, death is the answer. There is no ransom for a murderer. Did you know that? There is no substitute. There's no price. There's no one who can pay his price. The murderer has to pay with his own life. In verse 32, what about a manslayer? It says, you shall not take ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to live in the land before the death of the priest. So what if your family member was guilty of manslaughter but not murder, and he's incarcerated in this city, and you say, but I want him to come back and live with me. Is there a price I can pay? And the answer is no. He's guilty of killing an image bearer of God, even accidentally, and he cannot be bought out of the city of refuge. He has to stay there until the high priest dies. If he walks out of that city and he's killed by the avenger, he took his life in his own hands. In verse 33, it gives the reason, so you shall not pollute the land. It's all about purity in the land. It's all about a pure land. You shall not pollute the land in which you are. For blood pollutes the land. And no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. There's only one way for the sins of a murderer to be forgiven, for the land to be cleansed from that blood murder, and that's for that murderer to die. There's only one way to cleanse the land. You kill the murderer. God's very, very simple about this. And one more verse. Why is this cleansing so important? And the answer is because God would live in this land personally. Look what it says in verse 34. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell. See, I'm giving you this land as an inheritance, as a possession for you to live in, but I will live there with you. Remember the cloud of pillar by day, the cloud of fire, the pillar of fire by night. God, Yahweh, the Shekinah glory, the dwelling presence of God will live in the midst of Israel. And he says, for I, the Lord, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. It has to be pollution-free, and blood makes it polluted and impure. And the only way to cleanse the land when a murder takes place is to kill the murderer. Thank the Lord that America instituted these laws based on Numbers chapter 35. I pray to God that we would get back to these laws. We would have a much, much more orderly society. Father, thank you for the time.